Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Plot Lines. I'm your host, Connor, and today we have a great show planned for you. Today, I have Father Dave Nix with me. Welcome back to the show, Father. Plot Lines. I'm your host, Connor, and today we have a great show planned for you. Today, I have Father Dave Nix with me. Is that you or is that me? Show, Father. Sorry. You have it on in your background. Is that you or is that me?
I think it's you because
Are you sure?
let me see here.
You have it on in your background.
Do I? Okay, 1 second. I think it's. How about now?
Let me see. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Any echo?
No echo.
Okay, sorry about that.
No,
Yeah. I think that's because I was putting on my own YouTube channel and Twitter there.
All good.
Okay.
So welcome back to the show, Father. How you doing?
Thanks. Doing well. Yeah, thanks for having me.
So today we're going to be talking about priestly duties, and this idea of the conversation came to me when we were talking about the Cristeros, and you had talked about sort of what the duties of a priest would be in sort of a violent situation. So do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, it's such a great topic because, in the movie Cristeros, what happened in Mexico in the 1920s brings to the forefront that one priest who was involved in fighting against the Elias's whole anti-Catholic campaign. And we have 2,000 years of church history and magisterium on this topic. I think it obviously plays into where a lot of people are afraid our country could go. The very fact that we don't want to tap your algorithms too bad, but FBI, even enrichment admitted to targeting Latin Mass groups. And so this isn't just a medieval topic. The very fact that groups like Loopcast, Catholic Loop Podcast, are talking a lot about these three-letter agencies coming against Catholics puts this at the very forefront of what is the church's history of clerics and weapons, clerics taking the offensive, and clerics taking the defensive, because those are kind of different topics.
Gotcha. And it's the Cristeros is far from medieval. It's a 20th century story. So it's perfect example of this kind of situation that very well might take place in any country.
That's right. Yeah, in fact we saw down in Louisiana. I saw the thumbnail. I didn't click on it. It was excuse me. It was a big story, and I probably should have watched it, especially before going live with you. But most of your audience probably saw about 3-4 weeks ago, there was a first communion in Louisiana. Someone came in armed. I think they de-armed him before there was any shots fired. Am I right?
I'm not sure. I haven't actually heard this story.
It was a pretty big story. It was rural Louisiana, or at least it wasn't New Orleans. And someone came in armed at a first communion, and I think he was de-armed before shots were fired by either him or the ushers. So, this is stuff that this is also happening in Protestant churches, Protestant communities. There's a place here in Colorado called New Life. They have about 14,000 people that go there, and they had an active shooter about 10 years ago. I think the shooter got taken out by an off-duty police officer or some of the on-duty security guards. Joe Olstein's place had an active shooter less than a year ago. So, it's an important topic to look at with even where we are in America right now.
The amount of active shooters has gone up much higher just in the last, seemingly 10 years or so.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that happened prior. I don't think it did. I don't think that was common.
Yeah, I don't know of such stories in the 50s, 60s, 70s. There might be old West tales of not tales. There might be real things that happened in the 19th century. There is a famous story of a priest in the South who married an interracial couple, and then I believe the white girl's dad came and killed the Irish priest for her marrying a black man. It's an interesting story that took place in the South. I think it was first half of the 20th century. obviously interracial marriage is not the topic of our podcast today, but violence and priests and weapons has an interesting history in this country.
Yeah. And you had mentioned that on the other podcast that in a situation where, there was an active shooter and, there were laymen with you, you would, as a priest, you'd have the responsibility to basically sacrifice yourself, and then they would be able to defend themselves, but you would sacrifice yourself.
Yeah, so the history of the church is that clerics do not take up weapons. And I think we can take this all the way back to scripture. So remember the time when Jesus is in the garden and Peter says there are two swords. Jesus says that is enough. The church has traditionally seen that as the reason why Christendom is allowed to be armed. Two swords, it is enough. I think that even ties into the Second Amendment. So full transparency to your listeners, I'm very pro Second Amendment. I personally can handle anything from a 9mm to recently an AR. However, clerics in the first millennium of Christianity and the second millennium of Christianity, this isn't just like a new code of canon law modernist thing. Clerics are not to take up weapons, especially for the offensive. And this is where you already see Jesus say to Peter, he who lives by the sword will die by the sword. So we can talk a little bit later about the exceptions to this, like when priests of the Middle Ages were allowed to take up weapons for defensive cases, but it's pretty much unanimous across the board. Magisterium, canon law, everything else, that in war, even if it's a just war in the eyes of the Catholic Church, clerics are not called to be soldiers and soldiers not called to be priests. And you do have religious organizations that were out for the defense of Christians that were being taken over by Muslims, like the Knights Templar. But if you look at it, the Knights Templar were mostly brothers, lay brothers. They were committed to celibacy. They prayed a lot and they lived penitential lives, and they gave their lives for Christians. We can talk about why there's very valuable celibate vocations that do not include the clerical state. That's a big topic, but one perfect example is the Knights Templar, who were called to defend Christians against Muslims, but they themselves were not priests. They may have had chaplains, but the ones that were actually called to the front lines were not priests. So in a nutshell, to answer your question, it would be my job to die at Mass, not to pull out a gun and kill an active shooter. Even though I know how to use weapons, that's not my calling as a priest.
Is this different with Orthodoxy? In some Orthodox churches, I've seen images of like Orthodox priests with guns and stuff like that, and I don't know if they're actually like, using them in sort of in a violent, in violence towards another. But it just struck me as something that you would never see in the West.
I've never seen that. Now, were these Orthodox like I put on Telegram a week ago, a friend threw a bottle of paint up, and I had a sawed-off shotgun, and I hit it on the second try. It was my second time ever with a shotgun. I don't put those things on Twitter, but I put on my Telegram channel. And I mean, so that's the same as skeet shooting or something like that. And I was in the Roman collar, not the hermit habit. Was it something like that where it's just like a hobby, or did you see it as were these Orthodox priests kind of flexing like they would defend their church?
Yeah, well, I mean, so I don't know the context. This is something that, people share around to sort of show sort of how masculine Christianity can be, I think.
Yeah.
And sort of how masculine maybe Eastern Christians are. And so it looked like that. I thought I remember one where they have like, priest is holding two, maybe semi-automatic guns and stuff like that.
Well, it's interesting. I don't know the answer to that. I'm sort of just thinking out loud here. One difference, obviously, that all your listeners know is the difference between Eastern Orthodox priests and Roman Catholic priests is many, not all, but many Eastern Orthodox priests are married, and most, not all, Roman Catholic priests are not married. So there could be a difference on that in the sense that, celibacy is tied to wanting to die for others, not kill people. And a married man, he shouldn't want to kill people. A Christian married man should not want to kill people. But if you're raising a family, you have a higher duty to defend your family with at least the same level of weapons as the criminals out there have. So as you were talking, it just hit me. Maybe the difference on Eastern Orthodox versus Roman Catholics being armed is celibacy. I don't know. Just a thought. It could be celibacy.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, especially, if you have, maybe more I mean, to die for Jesus is what priests are called to do if necessary. But if you're also a married priest, and that, as you said, that happens a lot in Eastern Orthodoxy, and there have been a lot of instances where heinous violent acts have taken place, large attacks against Christians in the Middle East with
Yeah.
amongst Eastern Orthodox. So I could see that if there are a lot of, married priests in that situation,
Mhm.
that they might be more inclined or set up more to uh, defend themselves.
Yeah, I was just in Cairo and I visited a lot of Catholic churches, but I also visited some pretty big Coptic Orthodox churches. And for the Coptic Orthodox churches, especially the bigger ones, the more famous ones, you have to go through metal detectors to even enter the courtyard, even before you get to the church, to enter the courtyard of some of their major seats. You have to go through metal detectors because of a 2016 bombing that took place that produced 29 martyrs for the Coptic Orthodox Church. That was only, 8 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, you've spent a lot of time also just in the Middle East in general, right? Like,
No, I've been
no?
I've been around Greece twice the last year. I've flown through places like Dubai, but these 2 weeks in Egypt was my first time in an Arabic country for more than like a layover. I did live in a Muslim neighborhood in Calcutta at one point. Um,
I thought you went to the Holy Land
oh yeah. Sometimes I don't
recently.
think of Israel as the Middle East, but I've been to the Holy Land a couple times.
Okay.
I didn't mean that as a political statement. I'm not taking a side on the current war, but yeah, I've been to Israel twice. Yeah.
Uh, and what is like the status of Christians there? How what's your experience like with like Christians that
Mhm.
aren't visiting but just actually live there that you've met?
So they're not as armed as the Jews there for sure. I mean, probably even people that have not been to Israel knows that not only the young men, but even the young women go through the military training. So you'll see 18-year-old women with automatic weapons out in Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, and then the Christians they're often in their own neighborhoods, and my understanding is they're not armed. They're kind of second-class citizens in the eyes of the Jews. That's why a lot of Palestinian Christians they're slightly more pro-Muslim than pro-Jew, partly because of the current conflict, partly because of feeling like second-class citizens under Jews. Again, this isn't me taking a political side. I'm actually pretty apolitical on taking a side on the
Mhm.
um, Jewish versus Palestine thing. I mean, we know what side has more casualties, of course, but I never saw any Eastern Orthodox or Roman Catholics with any weapons out there.
Gotcha. Now, Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, he was a priest, and he had a big part in sort of drafting and bringing about, I believe, the Knights Templar. And so priests calling upon laymen, or in this case maybe brothers, because the
Mhm.
Knights Templar, I assume, were they consecrated to as brothers? How does that work?
I think there were a lot consecrated, but also you have to remember a lot of married men left their families for. So you can't walk from like Lyon, France to Jerusalem in a couple weeks.
Mhm.
So when the Pope in the 10th, 11th, 12th century called the Crusades and married men signed up, this was a commitment to say to your wife and your kids, I'm going to be gone 3 years. Oh, and I might die and I might never come back. So a lot of the people that signed up for the Crusades were actually married men. But you're right, it was popes and saints, even doctors of the church. Today's the feast of St. Anthony of Padua. He was not involved in any crusades, but who was the name of the Franciscan saint? Wasn't Saint Joseph of Cupertino. He was the flying saint. Capistrano, the Franciscan with the name of Capistrano. He was involved in these crusades. Now, again, he didn't have a weapon, but he might be on the very front lines as a standard bearer. Maybe he had a giant cross in his hand, something like that. But a lot of modernists think of Franciscans as just modern day hippies, but they were involved in the crusades just as much as any priest back then.
Do you think a lot of Franciscans have become, have tried to sort of take over the role of Benedictines more like, more like about like hospitality, stuff like that?
Well, I mean, the Franciscan spirit always did have a deep spirit of hospitality. We have to avoid the notion that going to the crusades is against hospitality.
Sure.
Right. You can actually be living a tremendous level of charity. I mean, you couldn't be canonized like Capistrano was without being at the highest levels of the unitive stage of prayer, which is charity. And yet he went on the crusades. So he would have been extremely hospitable and charitable. But he also understood that when Christian women are getting RAPED, we have to be on the front line. So he was a chaplain to the soldiers of the crusades.
Yeah. So, so let's.
Oh, and real quick, sorry, Connor. King St. Louis IX, I didn't know this till reading the Old Divine Office. Out in the Crusades, he made tons of Muslim converts. Many Muslims became Christians. So the notion of hospitality actually extends to your enemies too. Clearly, his charity was so high that Muslims were converting. So that's further proof. I don't mean to jump down your throat about the hospitality versus crusades, but that's just like further proof that you can be at the highest levels of charity and be on the crusades and be making converts and be loving people from a totally different culture. That's how the medieval mind worked.
Well, I wasn't trying to sort of put them against each other necessarily.
Yeah. Sure.
So let's go back a little bit to just general priestly duties. I think last time we talked, you said they were sort of in 3 categories. So can you explain what the categories of priestly duties are?
Yeah, so the 3 traditional munera, which means gifts or duties, is teach, sanctify, and govern. And the one most people are familiar with is the middle one, which is sanctify. Sanctify includes the 7 sacraments, which are extremely, extremely important. But again, it's one of the 3. And most people today, like I said to you on the phone before we recorded, a lot of people will say, oh, without you priests, we wouldn't have the Eucharist. Well, that's true. The Eucharist is much more important than me. But it's not the only thing we bring as priests. And I have my theories why the first and the third munera have been really dialed down in this heresy of modernism. But traditionally, even from biblical times, apostolic times forward, the 3 gifts of the priesthood was teach, sanctify, and govern.
Do you think this comes about because of secularism, the desire to shove priests out of society?
Yeah, that's a big part of it. I think, we traditionalists very much believe in the social reign of Christ the King. When you don't understand the social reign of Christ the King, or when one doesn't understand the social reign of Christ the King, especially the notion of a priest govern. Now, when we talk about priest governing, that doesn't mean they take an office in the state, because we were never allowed to become kings or senators or dukes or whatever else like that. But because the church was called to play a part in people's not just spiritual lives, but temporal lives, that meant many temporal decisions were influenced heavily by priests. And that's because most people, when they hear Christ the King, think Christ should just reign over their hearts, which is absolutely true. The first thing we want Christ to rule over is our hearts. But we as traditional Catholics also believe in the social reign of Christ the King, which is going to include priest governance of parishes and a heavy influence on the temporal matters of everyone's day-to-day life.
Yeah. So how familiar are you with Lord of the Rings?
Pretty familiar. I mean, I read the books 20 years ago, and I've probably seen the extended versions maybe 4 times after that. Boy, that's a lot of my life. I just admitted a lot of time watching TV.
Well, governance, just like that whole aspect of it, which I don't think people think or can really imagine very well. But if you want to sort of think of what like a priest governing looks like, I think people should look to Gandalf. Like, I think Gandalf is a perfect example of basically a priest performing his duty of governance.
I like that because it's not heavy-handed. Everyone knows that he has a power he's not flexing on. They all look to him, but he also lets them do their roles. I like that analogy. That's really good.
And he's sort of going around just bringing more and more supporters against basically to fight the devil.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. I like that.
I,
Because he's not ruling like Aragon, who actually is called to rule over a temporal kingdom. That's what a king would be called to. That's why we have no priest kings or bishop kings. They are separate roles. I like that. Yeah.
yeah, I mean it's just something you don't see a lot. It's kind of like, even like, also part of Gandalf's thing is that he sort of gets involved in everybody's lives as much as he can, and he gives them advice and counsel as
Yeah.
sort of he goes about this. But I see a lot of priests like pulling back, trying to avoid basically being part of people's personal life.
Yeah, a lot of that's fear. A lot of it's fear that, you can please 99% of your parishioners and one person doesn't like the advice. I'm not talking like the heavy scandals. I mean, you can have one person out of 100 not like the advice you give in spiritual direction or the confessional, whatever, and that person's going to write letters. And, most chanceries in this country, regardless of if they're conservative or liberal, most bishops just don't want letters on their desk. And the priests that get the letters are usually priests that are involved in people's lives. Again, I'm not talking about the really horrible scandals. I mean, priests who have opinions. Anyone as far right as me or as far left as James Martin is going to have letters written about them on their teaching. And most bishops don't want it. So most priests kind of recuse themselves. Well, see, now we're getting into the teaching aspect. The teaching munera is a very important one. And I think one reason a lot of priests don't teach is because they're not willing to face the risks of the white martyrdom that's entailed into it. Like, look at somebody like Fulton Sheen, Archbishop Fulton. You're in Chicago there, so you probably know a bit about Fulton Sheen.
Yep.
Anytime that he had a convert, he walked them through religious education himself. There was no such thing as, a lay board of RCA that he just dumped people into. This guy was running the international missions, had the largest TV show in America at the time, and he still found time to individually teach any convert he had. So the notion of farming out our teaching to a lay group of religious education, or a group of, lay missionaries or evangelists or whatever else, that's entirely borrowing from the Protestant communities. It's not a Catholic idea. Now, I'm not saying that lay people have to avoid evangelization. They should be doing it. But the notion that it's primarily a lay person idea, it's a brand new idea in the last 50 years. Out of 2000, we're talking 2,000 years of history. Priests were always called to be the main evangelists and the main teachers in any community.
I'm going to play devil's advocate for a second.
Yeah.
This is what I imagine the response will be, is that I don't have, if this is like a priest saying this,
Yeah.
I don't have enough time to teach all the, religious education that I would need to. Yeah.
Yeah. You and I talk off the air. We want to keep it pretty positive. I'll just say that, how do I put this in a charitable way? A lot of parish priests out there are doing video games at best at night. They have the time. They don't have the desire. That's the real issue. They certainly do have the time. I've had many parishes, and most priests are sitting around all day.
What about people who think that, we need to get the lay people more active in the parish, and that's one way of doing it?
Yeah, discipleship and the new evangelization, it's a very It's been a very popular term the last 10 or 20 years. The problem is, I was studying some of the Pew studies recently. Most American, this isn't me reading off of a trad website. This is right out of the Pew study. So I'm going to give some secular numbers right here. In fact, I put this on my blog. I didn't know we were going to talk about this, but might as well, as long as we're talking about this. This is from my blog today, and I'm going to read you just some of the stats from the Pew study, which is a secular study. So majorities of U.S. Catholics support the church allowing birth control, marriage for priests, as well as other measures. So this is the percentage of Catholics who believe Catholics should use birth control, 83%. Allow Catholics to take communion even if they are unmarried and living with a romantic partner, 75%. Allow priests to get married, 69%. Allow women to become priests, 64%. Recognize the marriages of gay and lesbian couples, 54%. So notice all those percentages were over 50%. That means most American Catholics are pro-gay marriage, pro-women priests, pro-married priests, pro-taking communion, living with a romantic partner, and the highest of all those, 83%, Catholics using birth control. So why in the world do all of these parishes talk about making disciples in the new evangelization without converting them first? You can't have people sleeping around on birth control, believing in gay marriage, and then making disciples of the new evangelization out them. You have to convert them first. And whose job is that? That's the priest's job.
Wouldn't it be also, though, that, doesn't the Pew study also say, like, how many people actually go to church? Like, what's the
Yeah, that's not in that one, but you're right. I mean,
like, how many people are responding and saying they don't agree with the church's teaching and they're not even going to church? And then
right.
the priest isn't even running into them to be able to even try and convert them if they're not even going to church.
I think a lot of them go once a month.
Okay.
But see, this goes back to the letter writing thing. I mean, any priest can give 2 pro-life sermons a year. No one's going to get in trouble for that, right? But when I preached against contraception, that ruffled some feathers. That got a lot of letters sent, right? Yeah. So this is where I blame this on the top down, not the grassroots, because if bishops won't support their priests preaching against contraception, now I never got in trouble for my bishop for preaching against contraception, thankfully, but there's a lot of people that wrote letters and I made people mad, and I preached it very charitably, but a lot of bishops in the country will not endure a priest preaching against contraception. So how do we convert them if these bishops who love the idea of the new evangelization and love the idea of making disciples won't let their priests convert their people?
Yeah, I mean, worldly concerns, many of them, but also, as you said, sort of, they've been taken out of society. They're not like, priests are just no longer allowed to be counselors, or no longer allowed to be teachers. They have to be basically instruments of a factory, right? Like, the sacraments are the only thing that they're really permitted to give out.
I think that's the case in your average parish. Now, I'm the first to recognize problems in traditional parishes, but let's talk about the obvious truth that traditional priests out there, I'm not saying they're all saints, but traditional priests out there, they are governing their parishes. They are running the catechesis. Sometimes when they have someone else teach it, they're still there, but most traditional priests are teaching the religious education. They're teaching the catechesis. They're not farming it out. If you look at your average FSSP parish or your average SSPX parish, most of them have like maybe a secretary paid 20 or 30 hours a week. A lot of them have a choir. Music is extremely important in Latin Mass, so a lot of them have a paid choir member. But you don't have armies of paid religious education teachers, because priests are actually doing that. So again, I'm not on your podcast just to promote Latin Mass parishes, because I admit that there's problems in them. But that is a place you are going to find priests still doing all 3 traditional munera: teach, sanctify, and govern.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen that many times, though I don't think that's universal, unfortunately.
It's
And I
not. Yeah.
don't know if that's because of the reasons that also happen in the Novus Ordo, but also um, maybe a lack of numbers as well. Not every parish has enough priests, in even in traditional orders.
But here's where traditional priests are making the time. I mean, we traditional priests, we're on 3 hours of the divine office every day. To do the new liturgy hours, it comes to about 40 minutes a day. So this goes back to what you asked 10 or 15 minutes ago. How is it that traditional priests are doing mental prayer, rosary, their daily mass, and 3 hours of psalms, and find time to teach? But the priests that have a 40-minute set of psalms every day, you can do all 5 canonical hours in a total of 40 minutes. Where is their time going? They certainly have the time. They certainly have the time to teach, because I was a priest in several Novus Ordo parishes, and they're farming it all out.
Yeah, makes sense. Now, when it comes to sort of counseling, or what was the term you used? It wasn't counseling.
Oh, sorry. There are some Novus Ordo priests doing teaching. I should make it clear. I don't think it's probably more than 5%, but there are 5% of those Novus Ordo priests, and they are doing great teaching. So I shouldn't make it totally black and white. And so God bless those priests that are teaching their own RE classes and convert classes and everything else. So God bless them.
What do you, so what was the term you used? You said teaching. What was the sacraments under?
Sanctifying. So teach.
Sanctifying.
Yeah, the three muna of the priesthood is teach, sanctify, and govern. So these are the three duties. That's the title of your podcast, right? The three duties of the priesthood is teach, sanctify, and govern.
So what can priests do better, especially just in governing? What does that look like for your average priest?
So I think that starts at the parish. I think even before we get into topics of like the social reign of Christ the King, or involving, or I should say influencing politics, even before we talk about things I do, like I get arrested inside abortion centers for prayerful prayer, and I counsel on the outside. Let's just talk about parish life. I mean, I think there's way too many memes out there about like the Susan of the parish council. It's way too easy to get a lot of mileage on it, but there's a reason why there's 1,000 memes on Catholic Twitter about Susan of the parish council running the parish. Well, think about what those memes imply, that women are running the parish. Now, this isn't even a man versus woman thing. It's who is called to run the parish. Is it the parish ladies who are the secretaries, who are the RE directors, or is it the priest? I don't think you have to be a traditionalist. I think even a lot of conservatives at the Novus Ordo out there are going to say, we want our priests running the parish. We are tired of these ladies running our parish. That's not just a traditionalist thing. There's a lot of good conservative Novus Ordo people out there who are tired of women running the parish, and the priests just like living in their rectories. Okay, if they're living in the rectories and they're on their knees praying all the time, great. But if they're in there playing video games like priests I know, they need to be out there influencing their parish. And it's like you said about Gandalf. That doesn't mean finger wagging and telling people, how whatever to eat and how to live every aspect in their home lives. But if a priest is very present in his parish and he's fatherly, there's just going to be a trickle down influence on everyone there. So I would say governing is primarily a ministry of presence. If the priest is there in his parish, he's going to affect people and he's going to influence them.
I know a lot of people who say that their priest isn't available as he should be, and that he has a secretary or somebody that is basically her mentality is to basically keep things off the priest's desk.
Yeah, I remember traveling through Phoenix once, and I stopped at a regular mainstream parish for confession once, and the parish secretary, I don't know if she was shocked there was a priest in a Roman collar in front of her who she didn't recognize, but I very nicely asked for confession, and it was like she was the gatekeeper of her priest schedule, and I was an intruder, And I thought, this is why so many Catholics go evangelical, that I come in, very nicely ask for confession, and she acts like this guy's, wife who's called to be the gatekeeper to his sacred life of whatever he's doing. I thought, this is why a lot of Catholics become evangelical. Our welcoming committee is people protecting priest schedules, which aren't even filled. Sorry, we talked about being positive. I'm pretty negative on this, but I think there's easy solutions. I really do. I don't think this is really complex liturgical solutions. Even before we talk about Vatican II, Latin Mass versus Novus Ordo, how about the priest just be available as a father to the parish? It's basic.
Yeah, well, I don't think laying down the basics
Yeah.
is in of itself negative.
Okay.
So, but it is quite interesting. I mean, that's certainly something the lay people, I think, would get behind, a lessening sort of what appears to be almost bureaucracy, uh,
Yes.
keeping the lay people from their priests. And I would think the best priests out there have the least sort of, um, a wall, the thinnest wall keeping them from their flock.
Yeah. I mean, when I was at a Novus Ordo priest, I remember once we had a all staff meeting, and the paid lady who was the head of the liturgy committee, this was a big Novus Ordo parish, the head lady of the liturgy committee asked me at this nice lunch why I use so much incense at Mass. And it's like, that, first of all, that's inappropriate to ask a priest. Secondly, it's inappropriate to ask in front of a whole staff meeting. And thirdly, what I wanted to say, and I didn't because I'm much more charitable than some of the things that go through my brain. I wanted to say, do you think I can go into your bedroom and ask and maybe make suggestions for you and your husband on your activity? Of course, I didn't say that, right? But that's what that is to a priest. It is none of your business how much incense I use on the altar. But she had a paid role as a liturgy director, and I thought, this is bananas.
Yeah, well, the liturgy director just seems a bit really strange to me. There seems to be a liturgy director for every church. I don't understand even the purpose of liturgy directors.
Yeah, but you could extend that to another bunch of paid jobs that FSSP and SSPX priests and ICK priests are actually doing. They just have to work a lot harder. Anyway, so this all goes back just to the three mooner, teach, sanctify, and govern, that it's a much bigger bandwidth than most people think. Let's talk real quick about the sanctify one. If a priest goes into the confessional, there's usually going to be a line. If a priest is in the confessional for 2 hours a week, he'll probably have 2 hours of lines. If he's in the confessional 30 hours a week, there's probably going to be 30 hours of lines. If he's in the confessional 40 hours a week, there's probably going to be 40 hours of lines. What does that tell you? That shows you your average Catholic out there is hungering to go to confession. And so if a priest doesn't know what to do with his time, the very, very, very best thing he can do is go sit in the confessional, and he'll be sanctifying. Maybe he doesn't think he's the best teacher. Maybe he doesn't think he can govern his parish with the politics in his diocese. But you know what he can do? He can sit in the confessional, and a lot of people will come. That is how you sanctify your parish. Did I get a little digitized there?
Sorry about that. My internet is wonky. What did you say? What was the last thing you said?
Oh, I just said, I just wondered if I got frozen or you got frozen there.
Yeah, I'm not sure. It's one of those things that the chat will be able to tell us who got froze.
Okay.
But it just says he's frozen, but who? Um,
Did you hear what
but
I
if
said
you
about
want to,
confession at least?
can you just sum up quickly? Sorry.
Yeah, I was just
We
saying,
got half through.
I was just saying, if a priest sits in the confessional, people will come, and that's the best way to sanctify his parish. So if teach, sanctify, and govern, the sanctify, the middle one, I said a priest may not think he's the best teacher. He may not think that he's able to govern his parish, but if he sits in the confessional, people will come. He doesn't have to have a lot of gifts. People, maybe gifts is an overused term. If he knows the basics of theology, if he's charitable, he can sit in his confessional and he will sanctify his parish.
Yeah, I think I froze. So if
I think it was you who
just
froze.
FYI, if that happens again.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
No
I
problem.
think you have better internet. So if I freeze again, you can always just take it from there. But yeah, no, definitely the mastering the three, I imagine, is a very hard thing to do.
No, that's what I'm saying. It's not.
Okay.
Look at. I don't think Saint Giambiani was as unintelligent as most people say, but let's say there's a little truth to that. How did he change all of France? Literally all of France. They had to put in a new rail line from Paris to Lyon, and then people went over to Ars from there. They believe he heard 1 to 2 million confessions, and it was just by sitting in his confessional. You can change all of France by sitting in your confessional. And he wasn't a master of languages. He didn't have, the personality to govern a diocese like a bishop could. He wasn't a theologian that probably would get asked to go teach at the seminary. I mean, his sermons are absolutely spot on and totally orthodox. But he sanctified his whole parish, his whole region, all of France by sitting in the confessional. I think it's pretty. I don't want to say it's easy. He lived on a potato a day. That's very ascetically difficult, but there's not a complex program to it.
So it's not a problem of intellect, or it's more just a problem of willpower. Is that what you're kind of getting to?
Yep.
Yeah. And so it seems that all three of these things the lay person needs to learn to value. Like, we need to encourage our priests to do all three. I think most lay people think mainly of the sanctifying.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think when priests find lay people loving their leadership, loving their fatherhood, loving them sitting in the confessional, loving them teaching the faith, they're going to do it. And I agree with you, Connor, that, maybe I'm a little too finger wagging on this podcast, but if there's lay people out there listening who go to the Novus Ordo, instead of finger wagging, the best thing you can do is say, Father, I went to confession to you a couple years ago. I'm sure you don't remember, but it changed my life. Or, Father, I love your sermons. Do you think you could teach a class? Bolster your request in an encouragement. Father, I love all your sermons. Could you also teach a class maybe for us? Father, there are so many people in line when you're in the confessional, because so many people's lives are changed. Why don't you dial up the hours a little bit? Father, we love when you're in the narthex and you come to, when you have like that parish dinner or question and answer period or theology on tap. Could we do it instead of 3 times a year? Could we do it every month? I think a lot of priests will say yes if a request is bolstered in a compliment like that. It has to be sincere. I'm not proposing something insincere. You don't want to ask a heretical priest to go teach more, right? I'm assuming he's an Orthodox man because your listeners are Orthodox. But I think a lot of requests that are bolstered in a compliment will be answered favorably.
Yeah, I think the viewers and listeners of this will know, we'll know a good priest when they see it.
That's right. Yeah.
So they'll know the right ones to ask, but also with your explanation for the 3 categories of priestly duties, I think this has just been really helpful for people to grasp more the fullness of the priestly vocation.
Yeah, my last parish assignment before I was a diocesan hermit, I was covering the cathedral in Jacksonville, Florida, and I was doing the Latin Mass there. And then I offered to all my Latin Mass families there, actually any family. There wasn't just the Latin Mass families, but that's my main flock. I offered to teach 2 classes in the basement. The first was how to attend the Latin Mass, just basically when you have your layman missal, how do you use the tassels? How do you go from page to page? What happens at the Mass? And then the other one we called we went through all the early heresies, which again sounds very negative, but it's really fun to go through the heresies because you see how they've all bubbled up again in modernism. But then by looking at the heresies of the early church, you actually get to know real Christology, Constantinople 1, 2, and 3, Chalcedon, all these infallible councils on Christ. Well, there was like 50 to 100 people at every class that I was doing there. People loved it. It wasn't like they just went to the Latin Mass and they raced home. They really loved coming for the teaching. So, this isn't just me in a hermitage saying priests should do more. When I was in parish life, I have proof that it was working. When I was in campus ministry, I was sometimes putting up to 40 hours a week in the confessional. That was much more valuable than being on podcasts. I'll be the first to admit that's a much more valuable life for a priest. But I put my money where my mouth is. That I think my record in one day was 10 hours in one day of hearing confessions. Because again, it's just like that baseball movie. If you build it, they will come. I'm not claiming to be a St. John Vianney or Padre Pio, but if you sit in there, they will come. You don't have to be the best priest in the world. I'm not the best priest in the world, but I sat in there and all these college students all came because they wanted their sins forgiven.
And one of the most lacking things was during COVID was like priests willing to give last rites.
Oh, don't get me started.
But yeah, so these types of things, even some of the sanctifying in the category of last rites is left without being done, and it's very tragic to see that happening. I hope that's returned. I hope people or priests are doing that again, but that was just
one archdiocese that you're quite familiar with had no baptisms in COVID, and I had to teach a Mexican father of several kids on FaceTime how to baptize his kid in that diocese because he couldn't find a priest to do it under the scamdemic lockdown in we'll say a certain archdiocese you're very familiar with.
That's against canon law, right? To prevent baptisms like
yes,
that.
But even worse than being against canon law, it's against the gospel. You have to remember the canon law is always under the gospel. It's against both.
Well, I think there's a limit or a length of time that you're not supposed to go beyond. Is that correct about how long you should wait or could wait to baptize a child? Isn't there a time after a certain amount of time it's sinful?
Yeah, the early church had a council that said, this is going to be a little bit of a showstopper for some of your listeners, so don't shoot the messenger. This is just what the church taught. There was a council in the early church that said it was a mortal sin to wait more than 1 week to baptize your infant postpartum.
Wow.
Because salvation is so dependent on baptism.
I thought it was like 40 days.
It's a week.
Yeah.
And if you look at like Google, go Google, we were just talking about St. John Vianney. Even his Wikipedia page will say he was baptized the same day he was born. That's the case for most of the saints, except for the early church when there was many pagan converts. Even the early church had babies baptized very early, but there was a lot of pagan converts. But in Christendom, if you look at the birthday of most saints, it's the same day of baptism, or I should say the baptism day is the same as the birthday for many, 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 many saints. Because that was the tradition of the church.
Could you mention scheduling that now?
Right. And see, this is the thing is scheduling is not one of the 3 priestly duties. Feast, sanctify, and govern is it, right?
Yeah.
So if the baby was baptized the very day of, that means the priest would go to the home. A lot of these were before hospitals. So mom would have baby at home, and then the priest would come over that day to baptize the baby. Now, I always say we live in the most superstitious time in all of church history. You even have some Nova Scotia parishes that say you cannot baptize a baby during Lent. That is totally a modern myth, has no basis in 2,000 years of history. And any priest saying that is absolutely in mortal sin. It is It's a superstitious modern myth. You have all these priests of history showing up at the doorstep of a baby born within 24 hours, making sure baby doesn't go to bed that night not baptized. And now you have priests saying baptism is forbidden in Lent. Show me anywhere in the Bible, the magisterium, or any code of canon law, even the new one, that supports that. You'll find it absolutely nowhere.
Yeah, that's crazy. I've never heard of that. Where did that come from?
Laziness.
Okay.
There's laziness, and then it just got, the can just got kicked down the road as a modern myth until it kind of grew to say, and then like I'm sure they back it up with something like, this is a time of meditation in the desert, so we don't, because you can back up any error with, cherry picking if you want. But
yeah, I mean, does that just go to show you that there's no belief in limbo as well?
exactly. I mean, that's it. That's exactly right. If you really believe baptism is necessary for salvation, you won't wait 24 hours to baptize your baby. Or you'll try not to. I mean, there's a lot of good Catholics out there probably listening to your podcast that say, Father Nix, Father David, I would like to do that, but I have to go through scheduling with my priest. Yeah, I get it. You just do your best.
Oh, yeah. Are we sure the fourth isn't scheduling?
Yeah, exactly. You can put a little pressure. Yeah, exactly. And or I'm not a big fan of doing it at Mass, but you can say, can we just get on for the Sunday schedule? I'm not a big fan. See, this is once again all the red tape. Why is it so easy in your average American Novus Ordo parish to receive the Eucharist? You don't have to even be Catholic, and you can get in line, and it's guaranteed you're going to be able to receive communion from some Eucharistic minister. But if you want your baby baptized, you have to have all this paperwork. Sometimes they make sure you're registered at the parish. Sometimes you have to have birth certificate. Probably some places require you to be a donating parishioner. Why is there all this red tape to get baptized but not receive the Eucharist? It used to be, in the first 1,000 years of Catholicism, quite the opposite of that, actually.
Yeah, I mean, you could, as long as you're, baptized, or you've received confession and stuff like that, you can, you have the possibility of going to heaven. But if you receive our Lord unworthily, that's damning.
That's exactly right. Yeah. And see, this goes back also to, I mean, one reason priests don't know their parishioners is because they have these mega churches. Like my dad worked at a place that has 26,000. He was just the computer guy at a Catholic parish in Denver that had 26,000 parishioners. Without weighing in on the Catholic megachurch versus not, let's just state the obvious. When you're at a smaller parish, you get to know your people. Now, of course, there's bigger issues. There's crises in vocations. There's not enough priests. Yada yada yada. I get it, but in the 9th century, if you're talking like 9th century France, even though we can't rewind the time to that, the fact is the priest knew his parishioners. I'm not saying they were all saints. There was probably priests that people didn't like. There was probably lazy priests and stuff. But when you have smaller parishes, the people got to know their priests, and the priests got to know their people.
So what's the deal with conditionally baptizing? What does conditionally baptize mean, and when is it appropriate to conditionally baptize somebody?
Oh, that's a controversial topic, but I'll answer it. So nowadays, if you go to seminary, what they will tell you in your canon law class and your sacramental class is that any Christian convert coming into Catholicism, we assume their baptism is valid unless that community or sect rejects the Trinity, like Mormons or Jehovah's Witnesses. So, in other words, if you come from like New Life megachurch and you want to become Catholic, most dioceses, most Catholic pastors are going to say, unless we have absolute proof this was a non-Trinitarian baptism, we're going to assume Protestants, Anglicans, Pentecostal, Baptist, All of those baptisms are valid. The only two they sideline for the most part, well, there's a longer list than just Mormon and Jehovah's Witness, but it's basically a group of sects that do not have Trinitarian baptism. Okay, I think it's great that they make sure that, say, a Jehovah's Witness coming into the church, they're going to make sure, your average Novus Ordo parish is going to make sure that person is baptized at Easter before, say, confirmation, first confession, first Holy Communion. Here's the problem. Before Vatican II, if you look in the old sacramental manuals and the old books of canon law, pretty much any Protestant coming into the Catholic Church, except for maybe high Anglicans, was conditionally baptized. Like, I was looking at an old manual in Latin, and it explained Methodists were conditionally baptized. So let's say you're an adult, 1930s, you're an adult Methodist and you want to come into the Catholic Church. The reason why your local priest would conditionally baptize isn't because he absolutely knew the Methodist baptism was invalid, but because the church erred on the side of the salvation of the person. So if you look in the old Latin description of Methodist baptisms, it describes it as this. It says the Methodists separated matter and form, meaning the Methodist minister would say, at least in some of the Methodist communities, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and then have 3 dunks or 3 pours of water, separate from saying Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So the church traditionally said, that's not good enough. You might have been baptized as a Methodist, but we're not sure. And because we're not sure, we're going to conditionally baptize you. But because the current hierarchy is so hell-bent on ecumenism, which isn't really ecumenism, it's the heresy of religious indifferentism, because the current hierarchy is so obsessed with ecumenism, they're only going to conditionally baptize Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, Quakers, and another list of like 40 very, very odd sects. But I remember when I first started studying this about 5 years ago, I texted an exorcist who's regular mainstream. He's a traditionalist, but he's, not a sedevacantist. He's totally in good standing with his diocese. I said, who would you conditionally baptize? He said, anybody but a high Anglican.
Interesting. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's also strange because if you're worried about, dealing with Protestants or ecumenicalism or whatever, ecumenism, sorry.
Mm-hmm.
It's weird that you'd be worried about that with somebody who is converting. Like,
exactly. I mean, the church always honored even psychological doubt. The church used to say, okay, if you're even doubting it, we're going to do it because we want you to feel good about salvation, because the church is a good mother. Wait, was your question about adults or babies on conditional baptism?
It wasn't specific.
Okay. So here's the answer on infants. Let's say baby's born barely breathing and dad baptizes the baby, but he's so nervous he doesn't know what he did. If the dad, and then baby lives. Okay, so let's say baby's born with, say, respirations of like 3 a minute. Dad panics, baptizes baby, as well he should. Any dad out there with a baby born in any distress should immediately baptize. But a lot of times parents get nervous in situations like that. Let's say he can't remember, maybe he grabbed saline solution instead of water. Or maybe he said Father, Son, and Holy Spirit and did 3 pours at the different time of saying, I baptize you in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. There's a bunch of different things. A good priest, especially traditionally, if the father came and said, I think I did it the right way, but I don't know, the priest would conditionally baptize the baby. In fact, in my old Roman ritual, which is just 20 feet from me, it has the conditional phrase, si capac sit, if you're capable, I baptize you in the name of the Father and Son and the Holy Spirit. So the church has always honored the need for conditional sacrament. It's not a rebaptism. That's the thing. A lot of modernist heretics will hear someone like me talking and say, oh, you're talking about rebaptism. That's a mortal sin of rebaptism. No. A conditional baptism is very different from a rebaptism. These are very, very different things. And the church has always honored the desire, not just the need. The church has traditionally always honored the desire for a conditional baptism for the sake of salvation and for the sake of psychological peace. That's just the tradition of the church. That's not my opinion.
Can a layperson conditionally baptize somebody?
You could, but in the case that I'm giving, right, like, yeah, so let's say like the baby's born with 5 respirations a minute, the dad does it, then the baby's in the neonate unit, the priest is on his way, and then the baby codes, and the dad realized he probably didn't do it the right way the first time, and the priest isn't going to make it there, then he's going to baptize his baby the right way. That's totally fine. Now, if you're looking at like 4 or 5 times in your life, okay, then you're into the realm of scrupulosity and you're messing with the sacraments, right? So you don't want to do this very often in life. But a conditional baptism is always to make sure, because there's nothing wrong in making sure.
Yeah, it reminds me of a story. Bishop Schneider, I believe he was born in I can't remember if it was like, it must have been Soviet Union, like camps of some sort. And I think his parents baptized him. I don't remember which one. And
Really?
eventually,
Wow.
and I believe they weren't sure if they did it right. I think they conditionally baptized him, or maybe not. I don't remember
Yeah.
exactly what it was. And then eventually, when like there was actually a priest let in there, or got in there, he baptized, or conditionally baptized, uh every baby that had been born
Really?
since. So does that it sounds like it lines up with what you're saying. Does that make sense?
Yeah, this isn't against the one baptism. A lot of people will say doing that is rebaptizing, which is a mortal sin. No, it's not. A conditional baptism is an atlas away from rebaptism. Totally different topic. So the priest was smart to do that
um
because he didn't know. He didn't know if the parents did it the right way. You know. Yeah. So Caitlin Smith said he was born in a camp. Where did you hear this story? I had heard that too. That they had to. I can't remember if it was Germany or, like you said, somewhere in Eastern Europe or behind the Iron Curtain or Russia. But I had heard that too. That they were raised, or he was raised in a place not friendly to Catholicism, if not fully legal.
Yeah, I believe it's in if you read Christus Vincit, his book,
Okay.
that's an interview by Diane Montagna.
Oh, very good.
You should be able to find it there. I might be recalling it poorly, so just FYI. Well, Father, I think this has been a great conversation. Thank you for doing this.
Yeah. Thanks for
People can
having me.
find your people can find your work at Padre Peregrino. Um, Anything coming up on your end?
No, let's see. Not many more travels coming up. I'm going to try to maybe get to DC to make it to the friends sentencing, people who I've been involved with Red Rose Rescue with. Those are the people who do prayerful work inside and outside abortion centers, and some of them are getting very heavy sentences. One woman's 75 years old, and she's getting sent for years to prison. So I just ask that your listeners pray for all the pro-lifers getting sentenced to very heavy time in prison under Biden's administration for very peaceful work. We're not even talking, and obviously we're not talking any violence against abortion workers. We're talking about peaceful work and people getting sent to very heavy time in federal prisons. So please pray for them.
Yeah, definitely. Let's pray for them. Well, thank you, Father. It's really great talking with you.
Yeah.
And
Thanks for all
thank
your
you
great
all
work,
for
Connor.
watching.
Yeah.
Please like, share, comment, and subscribe if you like this work. Thank you, Father, for coming on.
Thanks a lot for having me, Connor. God
God
bless you.
bless everyone. Have a
Bye-bye.
good one. Bye.